Welcome to the Black Father's Pulse, the podcast where fatherhood meets purpose. I'm Dr. Alvin Thomas, clinical psychologist and professor, here to guide you through the multifaceted journey of Black fatherhood. Please note, the views expressed here are my own and not those of my employer. But get ready to dive into the dynamic world of Black fatherhood, where we celebrate the highs, tackle the lows, and share plenty of laughs along the way. Let's keep the pulse of fatherhood beating strong and vibrant. This episode contains detailed discussions of death, violence, and trauma that some listeners may find disturbing. If you need support, the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is available 24/7 by calling or texting 988. The National Alliance on Mental Illness Helpline can be reached at 1-800-950-NAMI. That's NAMI. The crisis text line is also available by texting HOME, HOME, to the number 741-741. Listener discretion is advised. Today we're separating real trauma from the internet version and thinking about how it could save a child's life. I'm here with Dr. Noni Gaylord-Harden, who studies trauma in Black youth and families, and not the kind where your latte was wrong, but the real kind: community violence, loss, and stress that really rewires young brains. Dr. Noni Gaylord-Harden is a professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Texas A&M University and the director of the Youth Rising Lab. Her groundbreaking research focuses on traumatic stress and mental health in Black youth and families, particularly examining how community violence exposure affects adolescents in divested urban communities. With over 7,000, you heard me, 7,000 citations of her work, Dr. Gaylord-Harden is dedicated to moving beyond traditional treatment approaches toward healing and empowerment, conducting community-based research designed to improve the lives of African American youth and their families. Welcome to the Black Father's Pulse, Dr. Gaylord-Harden.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
So I'm going to jump in straight and ask you to just, if you could tell us, help us try to understand what trauma is. Everything is trauma now. What's your reaction when you see a TikTok about, say, grocery store trauma?
Right. That's a great question. And trauma really refers to a severe emotional reaction to a terrible event. And sometimes people use it to refer to the terrible event itself. But you're right, it's become a buzzword, and it is common nowadays to talk about many of our everyday problems and stressors, our reactions to those everyday stressors, as trauma. I'm guilty of doing that myself, right? The problem is that the experience and perception of stress is subjective, right? So what may be highly stressful to one person is not as stressful to the next person. So I hesitate to call people out on their use of the word trauma, like saying grocery store trauma.
Right.
There are legitimate concerns now that using trauma to describe things like being stuck in traffic or feeling overwhelmed in a store is going to trivialize the word and make it more difficult for people who have experienced trauma as it's conceptualized in clinical spaces, right?
Right.
But to be honest, I'm glad to hear the word. I'm glad that people are using it. And that my hope is that the use of the word will start to reduce some of the stigma associated with, psychological symptoms and disorders. And some people are using it in ways that therapists may not approve of. But sometimes those folks are people whose trauma has been disenfranchised, people who felt invalidated or unheard or unseen or even judged in some of their emotional struggles. So I think it's a little complicated, right? Where there are risks to using it to characterize everything, but at the same time, it is creating more awareness about trauma itself.
So on one hand, it's inviting people who would not be in that space to use the language and the culture that comes with mental health. And on the other hand, there's also the self-medication, self-diagnosis that could come from a person just assuming that this is the language. So my child has trauma, and therefore I want services for trauma, even if the child may have no trauma. It is a very difficult space to walk. I err on the side of or maybe this is what it does. Maybe it does create space for us to increase public awareness and communication around trauma. And because people are using the language, they may be more willing to come into those conversation spaces and receive the elucidation that helps to change how they're thinking about trauma. Okay.
I think so.
Okay. Now I see why you have these 7,000 citations. Yeah.
I don't know if that's the reason, but okay.
So can you walk us through your journey into researching traumatic stress and mental health in Black youth and families? How did you get into this work?
Yeah, that's interesting. I was a coping researcher at the beginning of my research career. When I was in graduate school, the term resilience really became more popular in the research on child development and clinical child psychology, and I became very interested in resilience and trying to understand how people, quote unquote, beat the odds, right? And I also developed an interest in understanding coping. The coping literature for children and adolescents was, just beginning. And so my dissertation was merging those two things together. And in my dissertation defense, one of my committee members asked about the measure of coping that I was using in my study, because my study was with Black youth, and the measure was the most validated measure at that time, but it was developed with white middle-class youth. And so I started thinking more about unique ways, culturally relevant ways that that Black youth might be coping with stress. And so I started out as a coping researcher. I wanted to better understand how Black youth were coping with stress, both how they were using mainstream coping strategies and what specific culturally relevant coping strategies they were using. Now, I was adamant that when I was measuring stress, I was not going to focus on any one domain. So I measured stress in multiple domains: peer stress, school stress, family stress, economic stress, discrimination, exposure to violence. I didn't want to hone in on one. Well, I was in Chicago at the beginning of my career, and our conversations with young people, with teachers, with parents, everything kept coming back to violence exposure. And so I must admit, I reluctantly went into this work on violence exposure, just honing in on that as a stressor rather than, multiple domains of stress. And I thought I was going to continue the exact same work I was doing, but things went in a different direction as I started honing in on community violence. But that was it. It wasn't, I started out doing something different, and just through conversations with young people and adults who work with them, I ended up honing in on violence exposure as a stressor.
It seems like almost every researcher I've spoken to, almost every faculty member I've spoken to, including myself, where we end up doesn't always seem to be where we started. We start at some other space and we end up in something usually not radically different, but definitely connected to the thing that we were originally researching, but usually not in an area that we thought we would. Like, if you told me that people would be like, "Oh, Alvin, you're a fatherhood researcher," I'm like, "What? No, I do youth violence. I do violence exposure," which is kind of how we met. If you told me that, social media, like, I don't do social media. That's not the thing that I do. But it seems to be the path that my research is going into. So I remember a point when we used to talk about disadvantaged communities, or, well, even further back, we would talk about poor communities. And sometimes some very derogatory kind of blacklisting kinds of names. but you're using the term
Disinvested.
disinvested
Yes.
communities. What do you mean by disinvested urban communities, and how does this context specifically impact Black adolescents?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that was a very purposeful shift in my research. I mean, if you look at some of my earlier work, I, use this term low income community, right?
Yeah.
But I read an article about 5 years ago where they were talking about language and the power of language. And they cautioned against combining a deficit and a place.
Mm.
So when you're describing a community, not using these terms that represent a deficit in that community, and really being more accurate in what's happening to the community, right? And so the word disinvested refers to communities that have experienced very significant and purposeful withdrawal of vital resources and economic investments in the community. So disinvestment is usually the result of things like redlining, so historical practices of redlining, suburbanization, which took jobs and industries and economic power from cities, racist housing policies, predatory lending practices, right?
Right.
Even lack of political representation. And so what happens is that this economic disinvestment results in areas of concentrated poverty in areas that lack adequate job options. You might also see inadequate or inaccessible healthcare, food deserts, abusive policing, negligent policing, underfunded schools, which specifically affects young people, unsafe and unaffordable housing. So it's this cycle of poverty that becomes very difficult to break because there aren't resources in the community that allow people to pull out of this. And so this structural and institutional racism that leads to economic disinvestment creates these communities. And all of these factors that I mentioned a moment ago elevate levels of violent crime in a community. And that leaves Black adolescents, Black children, Black families in disinvested urban communities in particular, systematically exposed to community violence.
Thanks so much for that clarity. How does this community violence exposure differ in its from other forms of trauma? So thinking about the impact on young people, how is that different? Community violence versus other forms of trauma.
Yeah, that's a great question. And when we talk about community violence, we're talking about violence that it happens in public areas. It's interpersonal in nature, but it happens in public areas. And it is by individuals who are not intimately related to the individual, but that's also subjective because it could be someone that they know, but it's violence that happens in public spaces. And so adolescents can be direct victims of community violence, or they can witness violence happening to somebody else, or they can even hear about it, right? But what we've noticed in our work are kind of four things that make community violence different from the other stressors that we've studied. One is that it's uncontrollable. Young people, if you talk to them, they do not believe that they can change the levels of violence that are in their community. For many young people, and in our studies, it's repetitive and chronic. And, people who study stress know that uncontrollable and chronic stressors are the worst stressors for kids to experience, right? It also increases during developmentally vulnerable times in a child's life. And that's the transition to adolescence, right? So usually when I talk about this, I ask my audience, like, what's going on during adolescence? And you can list a ton of things that are happening to young people during adolescence. But then you add on this stressor that increases during this time. What you tend to see, like family violence, maltreatment tends to decline as kids get older, but what increases is community violence. So it increases as kids are transitioning to adolescence. And then the fourth thing is that it is a traumatic stressor. So it's often associated with bodily harm or the possible death or loss of friends or loved ones. And it tends to be outside of the usual experience. So those are the 4 things that we have found to be unique about community violence exposure in the lives of young people in our work.
So if you were to describe what this looks like, what this violence exposure looks like for the average 12-year-old kid in a disinvested community, how would you paint that picture? What would that look like? Because I think that there might be listeners who are thinking, we don't have that in our community. We don't know what this looks like. What is it? So? And again, so I can tell you a couple of things that just coming out of my own clinical experiences and just in general, I know of kids who have gone to school and seen a dead body.
Yes.
Laying on the side of the street.
Yes.
A friend of mine when I was in college told me about coming from home and on the bus and getting off of the bus and seeing a severed hand on the side of the street. And I was like, and he was like, "Oh yeah, that didn't affect me." I'm like, "That didn't affect you?" Like, or even more so now. The pictures you talked about, not just the things that are seen, but the things that you hear, the things that I have a group of guys that I work out with, and they talk about some of the experiences that they had growing up in certain parts of the U.S., talking about seeing people shot in the head, like point blank range. And again, I'm going to put a disclaimer at the beginning of this episode because this is very heavy stuff. But to me, these are some of the more extreme. And I think you mentioned that there's a decline in the levels of family trauma, what's happening at home, as there's an increase in the community violence exposure. And I could think that is part of what happens in adolescence. The peers and persons outside the family start to take a more prominent role.
Absolutely.
And there's greater exposure to the diversity of families and people that are outside there. And so that gives opportunity for trauma. So I don't know if you still want to, but if you can paint a bit of a picture of what that looks like.
I mean, I think what you mentioned is accurate. And to be honest, it can mean many different things, right? It could mean hearing gunshots in the neighborhood. So maybe you don't even see the gunshots, but you hear them, or you don't see the gun being shot, but you hear gunshots. It can mean seeing a dead body. Right? As I mentioned earlier, a kid could be the direct victim of violence. So maybe somebody threatens them, seriously threatens them, chases them, physically attacks them, robs them. They can be attacked with a weapon. They can be shot at or stabbed. They can also witness any of those things happen to other people, or see these things happen to someone else. And as I mentioned, in some cases, they can hear about these things. Maybe someone was shot and killed on their block. They didn't see it happen, but they heard about it. And we know that violence has a ripple effect throughout communities. So even if you don't see it, you hear about it. And that in and of itself has an impact on you. I should also note that social media has also changed the game. We don't yet know a lot about how much violence kids are exposed to, community violence online. But I know people are working in this area, and we're starting to try to collect some data in this area as well. But that's another piece that's added on is rewatching fights that happen in the community and that happen at school, right? And some kids only experience one event maybe in childhood and adolescence, and then others may experience multiple events. So multiple things may happen to them in terms of the list that I just gave. But those are some ways that violence can show up in the lives of young people.
Thank you very much for that. So I know we've been talking about trauma and defining trauma, well, not defining it, but how people are using it or misusing the term. What would be your real definition that you would give people to hold on to, something that they can hold on to and remember for trauma?
So to be technical, according to the DSM, traumatic stressors are things that involve a threat or or the actual occurrence of death or severe injury. And again, this can be through direct victimization or witnessing or learning about things happening to other people. So when you're talking about things that threaten um, your body, threaten you physically, or that could result in death or severe injury, then you're moving into what we consider to be traumatic stressors. So things like combat exposure, abuse or neglect for young people, sexual violence, physical assault, community violence, of course, even serious accidents. So if a person is in a very serious car accident, or natural disasters that result in death or severe injury. Traumatic separation is also another example of that. So really extreme events are what we think about as traumatic stressors. General stress or everyday stress, that we feel and experience, is our body's natural response to pressure. So this kind of state of being worried or tense that we experience when we're in some sort of challenging or difficult situation would not be characterized as trauma, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much for that. So to help people, to help our audience, not just the parents and adults who are listening to do it for themselves, but to also help younger people kind of pass out what is a difficult day from what is a traumatic experience. Let's create a brief trauma test for our audience. What 3 questions should people ask before using the word? 3 questions that would let them know that would help them understand whether an experience that they're going through right now could be categorized as trauma or stressful experience that I'm going through right now.
Yeah, I think one question, am I describing a genuinely overwhelming experience? Right? Is this disrupting my sense of safety or physical integrity? Like, am I describing something that's genuinely overwhelming and threatening? And yeah, maybe I could think of 3.5, but because the 0.5 for that one is this term necessary and accurate for what I'm describing? Or could I be using things like stressful, difficult, upsetting, challenging, right? So am I genuinely describing something, or describing a genuinely overwhelming experience? I think the second thing is, am I using trauma to communicate something meaningful, or am I going for impact? Because sometimes we use a stronger language when we want to really emphasize how difficult something is. Maybe we don't believe it was traumatic, but we know the impact of saying that word means that people pay attention to us. So is trauma the most accurate description of what you're going through, or are you using it because you want your experience to be taken seriously? Right. And I think the third thing is, am I being respectful to those who've experienced clinical trauma? Am I being respectful to those who have gone through some of those things that I mentioned a minute ago? If I'm describing being overwhelmed at the grocery store because there's so many choices or it's too many people, is that respectful to someone who's gone through some sort of assault or some sort of very traumatic accident or natural disaster? So I think those are the 3.5 things I would put out there when thinking about using the term.
That is really, I like that. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah.
So when you think of the work that you're doing in Black communities, thinking about the hidden trauma, because often trauma is not spoken about, or it's misdiagnosed. It's treated as anger, as behavioral problems, as all kinds of other things, except for what it really is, which is trauma. What's the most heartbreaking pattern you see in your work?
Self-blame. The pressure that and not just young people, but this comes up with adults as well. But so it's just heartbreaking to me, no matter who says this. But people put pressure, and young people put pressure on themselves to be aware of everything that's happening around them.
Mm-hmm.
And on more than one occasion, I've heard a victim of a shooting blame themselves for not being more aware of their surroundings, or not heeding to maybe that small inner voice that may have been warning them. And
Yeah.
to me, that's heartbreaking, because this is
Yeah.
not your fault,
Yeah.
right? But self-blame is a common reaction that we see.
Yeah, that is yeah. It gives me pause, because it is something that I've heard very recently. Young people, or people in general, just being either blaming themselves or
Yeah.
family members in an attempt to cope with the trauma that they're currently experiencing. They're trying to find reasons and trying to find ways to, and they're like, if he or she had just, then this would not have happened. And I'm like,
we don't know
Yeah.
what. Yeah,
I
but it's hard.
yeah.
That's the people are trying to make meaning of
Yeah.
what has happened in their lives, and that's a place where people go. Yeah, and yeah. So not only are young people putting pressure on themselves, people might be getting pressure from other people. Do you remember that scene in Boys in the Hood? The very end, I don't remember all the characters' names. I am
Yeah,
so
me
sorry.
neither.
That was
Yeah.
many years ago. But when the character was shot and killed, and his brother came home, and the mom was screaming at the brother like, "This should have been you." Why? And making it like he didn't protect your brother, and
Right.
he's the one that should be here, right? And
Right.
it's like, so not only, I mean, he was already blaming himself, but then you
Right.
get this added layer of family telling you that there was something you should have done or should not have done, or that one person's life is more valuable than
Yeah.
another's. So,
Yeah, you pointed that out, and all I was hearing was the almost existential, transactional nature of life for people in these kinds of communities, where you assume that it's a form of bargaining. It's saying, take him instead, because
Yeah.
we see the promise in this other person. Please, can we change this current situation and give you this person instead, or give you this thing instead?
Yeah.
That to me is when you know you're in trauma territory.
Yes. Without a doubt.
Yeah.
Without a doubt.
Anyway, so thank you very much for that. So there are a few myths that I want you to bust for us. And you can just answer with a true or false, and if you want to.
Okay, let me let you know. I don't do well with true false questions, so I'm letting you know up front, dude. So I'm the worst person to ask true false questions to. But let's give it a shot.
let's see what happens.
Okay.
All right, true or false?
Okay.
Black kids are naturally more resilient.
See, I'm already messing up on the first question. So what do we what do we mean by resilient? And more resilient than whom? I mean,
they've been through so much.
So what does the resilience look like? That they can handle more, or that they're not experiencing any negative outcomes? I would caution against using that. I know people say that, but I would say more that maybe Black communities, Black families have these assets that are embedded in the community and the families, that unique assets that may help young people in managing this. I'm hesitant to say that just as a group, Black kids are more resilient. I struggle. It doesn't mean they're not resilient, but I don't.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. See, I messed that all the way up. I'm sorry.
All right, let's try this one.
Okay.
Strong
Yep.
families don't have trauma.
Okay, that's false. I
Okay.
got you. Yeah,
And trauma only affects troubled youth.
that's false.
Okay.
Yeah.
Those did not bring out that level of
I mean, I
passion and
can, but
questioning.
I was trying to hold
You're
back
trying to hold back.
because I messed up on the first one. Yeah, no, I mean, strong families don't have trauma. Trauma can affect anybody, anywhere,
Right.
anytime. So, you know, you're not immune. Nobody's immune to exposure to traumatic stress. Um, some groups are more systematically exposed versus other groups. But and in terms of the trauma reactions, it doesn't mean that you don't have a reaction to trauma just because your family is strong or just because you as an individual are strong. And then, of course, trauma only, I think you said affecting troubled youth, of course, is
Right.
false because trauma can affect anybody. Um, so, yes.
So let's talk about some of the signs that adults consistently miss. What are some of those signs?
Sometimes um, small things like a difficulty concentrating or focusing, um, changes in appetite, maybe more anger. And some of this, because there's an increase in violence exposure during adolescence, some of this just looks like the hormone changes that young people are experiencing during adolescence, the anger, but you might see kids getting into more fights, unexplained physical pain, so they might start complaining about headaches or stomach aches, and these things don't have a medical cause. You might also see some difficulty sleeping. And even with younger kids, you might see nightmares. For younger kids, you may also see kids reverting to behaviors that they showed earlier in development, like bedwetting
Yeah.
or not wanting to separate from a caregiver. But those, I think the difficulty concentrating, the unexplained physical issues, and some of the anger stuff that could look like other things are some of the signs that we all sometimes miss.
So I'm even thinking of things like appetite reductions,
Appetite reduction is
or
another one. Yeah.
significant appetite, even an appetite increase, significant irritability,
Irritability.
significant changes in patterns, school avoidance, excuses.
Yeah, that's
all
the
of
separation
those.
anxiety. Yeah, not
Yeah.
wanting to separate from adults
Yep.
and they don't want to go to school or
Yep.
go
All of
out.
those are telling you that something is different in my environment, and it
Absolutely.
is either scaring me or overwhelming me, and I need help with it.
Yes.
So I know part of your work is identifying these and identifying the effects of trauma. But I know that you're even more interested in trying to understand what healing might look like for Black families. What are some of these natural healing practices that you've seen in Black communities? And do you see them working?
Yeah. So, I like to think about healing as a journey and not an endpoint or destination. And healing is another word that I- you know, I appreciate that people are using more, right? Because healing it really it's not just bouncing back. Does that make sense? So when we think about resilience, it's like bouncing back and getting back to baseline. And healing is
Right.
more than that. And healing as a family means that people are involved in kind of this shared emotional processing of the trauma. They're integrating this into the family story. So rather than we're not going to talk about this, or this didn't happen, or that you didn't see that, right? It's integrating this into the family story. And I think that helps folks develop healthier coping mechanisms in response to the trauma. And then when you're processing these things as a family, the hope is that you're regaining the capacity for shared joy. Like you're not just coming back to baseline. You're eventually getting to a point where you can experience this shared joy, um, and a sense of safety for young people. So healing is or families providing a sense of safety for young people, and enhancing the healthy relationships. But I think, it has to involve processing what happened. It can't be a sweeping it under the rug, or we don't talk about this, or you didn't see this. It becomes part of the family story.
Thank you so much for that. So, again, this is the Black Fathers Pulse podcast. So, we are speaking to fathers. We're speaking to young people. We're speaking to mothers. We're speaking to everybody. But if you could look into the camera and talk specifically either to Black fathers, Black children, Black people struggling with trauma, what do you want them to know?
I think I would say that you are not alone. You are seen, you are heard, you are valued, you are loved. Your feelings are valid and important. It's okay to feel scared or sad or overwhelmed or angry or confused or any other feeling that you might be experiencing. What has happened to you is not your fault, and you are deserving of support. Healing.
And my final question, this is very heavy work. What keeps you doing this heavy work?
I don't know that it's one thing, to be honest with you. I have been in spaces with young people and heard stories that keep me awake at night. And sometimes for me, the moments that are most moving and motivating are experiences with adults who are in tears because they want to support young people. I talk to a lot of folks who work in youth serving organizations and community agencies, and the tears I have seen from folks who want to get this right and who are worried about, because they're bearing the burden. They're hearing these stories every single day, and just knowing that there are adults in the lives of young people who want to get it right and who want to be there and be a continued presence in the lives of young people keeps me motivated.
So we didn't even touch on vicarious trauma, which is what it sounds like these persons who are doing this work are dealing with. Maybe that's our next conversation. We can dig deeper into trauma and start talking about vicarious trauma. So that was Dr. Noni Gaylord-Harden reminding us that behind every statistic is a young person who is deserving of real understanding, real help, and real healing. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to the Black Fathers Pulse. I'm your host, Dr. Alvin Thomas. I'm a clinical psychologist, researcher, and director of the Tri-Lab at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Views shared on this podcast are mine or that of my guest and are not associated with the university. Original music for our series was composed and performed by Micaiah De Silva, artwork by Isabella Acra. The podcast is produced by me and is supported by the kind contributions of you, the public, and advertisers. Follow me on Twitter at Dr_AT758, that's Dr_AT758, or the Black Fathers Pulse podcast on Instagram and YouTube. Subscribe to the Black Fathers Pulse podcast wherever you do your podcast listening, and don't forget to share and leave us a positive review.